October 7th broke us. The shock of it, that Israeli borders could be breached, the horror of watching dancers celebrating Sukkot, freedom and love, kidnapped, hunted, raped, murdered, seeing the peace-loving kibbutznikim hide in their safe rooms, the terrorists setting their homes on fire, the pure agony on the faces of their loved ones as they watched their slaughter broadcast by the terrorists on social media. October 8th destroyed us. Tenured professors at Ivy League universities saying they were exhilarated. Americans calling these monsters freedom fighters. Jews being attacked in the streets of Europe, London. Synagogues set on fire. Jewish students locked in Hillel buildings. Campuses no longer being safe. 150 pro-Hamas rallies before Israel did anything in retaliation. Some of our most fundamental beliefs have been shattered. That the project of Israel is secure and that we are fully accepted and safe in North America. The basic belief that our position as Jews was one of fundamental safety. That the state of Israel meant a fundamental shift in human history, that it meant never again to pogroms. The belief that peace was possible and perhaps even imminent. And here in the States, that our allies shared our values. We thought we were in relationships that were reciprocal, but instead we feel unseen, betrayed, and lonely. In his 2014 Eli Talk, which is Jewish for a TED Talk, An Unrecognizable Jewish Future, a Queer Talmudic Tale, Rabbi B'nai Lappi describes what happens when our fundamental beliefs are shattered by an event that goes against everything we believed possible. The rabbi says there are 3 and only 3 possible reactions to a crash. Option 1, denying the crash has occurred and reverting to your master story and hanging on for dear life. And people tend to build walls around that old master story to make sure nothing interferes or threatens it again. 2, it would be accepting that your master story has crashed, completely rejecting that master story and jumping off into a completely new story. Or option 3, to accept that the story has crashed, but instead of abandoning the story, you stay in it, reinterpreting it through the lens of the crash, and building a new story from the amalgamation of the original story, the crash material, into some new reinterpretation. As someone who believes in the Kabbalistic idea that God created humanity in order to perfect creation, that we are God's partners and hands in this world, the crash of the premise that our allies share our values, that the relationship is reciprocal, is one that I have been grappling with in this past year. I have, in many moments, found myself in what Rabbi Lappi describes as scenario 2, tapping out, abandoning what had been my values because the story I had been telling myself about our relationship with allies had proved to be incorrect. When I marched with the NAACP to restore voting rights, I met a woman, Keisha Thomas, who I admired very much. She had earned some renown back in 1996 when there was a KKK rally and a counter-protest in her town. Keisha was there when an organizer of the counter-protest yelled that there was a Klansman in the crowd. The man wearing a Confederate t-shirt was knocked down by some of the counter-protesters, and they began to physically attack him. Keisha threw herself between her allies and this man, making a human shield in order to protect him, I have been so proud to call her my friend. And she was the top person showing up in my social media feed, calling on others to free Palestine. I responded, and she couldn't believe that I would defend Israel. I was so tired and wounded and didn't have the capacity to argue with her right then. She is an example of someone that I walked away from. The second camp, my story was shattered, so I left that story. We weren't really friends anyway. And Lord knows, I have often been in the first camp, denying that anything has changed at all. I tell myself that it doesn't hurt, and it doesn't matter that they have failed to stand with us, because I was never there just for them. I was there because we are women, because we are non-binary, because we are black and brown. I was there for me, for God, because my faith tells me this is where I should be. It doesn't matter if Black Lives Matters, a completely domestic organization, feels it has to call out Israel out of every country in the world and accuse Israel of genocide and apartheid and colonization. I would work for racial justice because the Torah teaches me that we are all created in the image of God. We are all one family. And it doesn't matter if there are drag queens calling for Palestine who accuse Israel of pinkwashing, because I believe that God creates us in variety and wants us to be ourselves, and that Judaism is about love, and that, as Genesis tells us, it is not right for human beings to be lonely. So I have stayed, and I have partnered, and I have avoided and not allowed the conversation to turn to Israel when that was not why we were there. The rabbis of the Torah note that it says in Genesis that Esau hates Jacob. From this, they say there is a halakha, a rule, a fact that Esau hates Jacob. But that doesn't mean that Jacob has to hate Esau. We do the right thing because that's what it means to be Jacob, to be Jewish, not because we expect anything in return. Do we hope? Would we like to see it? Would we like Esau to love us? Yes. But is that why we do what we do? No. And as I talk about walking away from these so-called allies, Camp 1, or showing up next to them even though they disappoint, Camp 2, I want you to know that I have so much compassion for all of you and what you are doing, where you are on your journey. If you need to walk away or just avoid talking Israel while you walk together, I get it. As I said, I am there too. But where I want to be is in that third space. What I'm struggling to do is to follow option 3. To repeat Rabbi Lappi, option 3 is to accept that the story has crashed, but instead of abandoning the story, you stay in, reinterpreting it through the lens of the crash and building a new story from the amalgamation of the original story and the crash material and the reinterpretation. So I want to share a few stories. The first is from our friend and neighbor, Pastor Robert Brooks. He was with us after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and Pastor Brooks came to our community for the vigil right after October 7th. He has been there for us. Yet, as acts of violence against Jews mounted and campus protests took hold, as influential Black leaders condemned Israel and too many spread anti-Semitic tropes, I heard nothing from him, and I was hurt. Then MLK was approaching. We have a tradition of inviting his congregation to join us for the Shabbat that weekend, and Pastor Brooks will often speak. Part of me wanted to say, let's skip it. Another part wanted to pretend that nothing had changed. I reluctantly texted him an invitation, and you can hear my reluctance in the fact that I sent a text instead of calling. But Pastor Brooks called me back. He accepted the offer to come and preach and asked what he should talk about, what we needed to hear. And so I told him that we needed to hear that he doesn't hate us. We are not alone. And he was so confused. Why would I ever think that? He hadn't made the connection between what was happening in Israel and what we might be experiencing. He had no idea that we were scared, lonely, or felt misunderstood. There was so much violence in his neighborhood, in his community, he was not paying attention to ours. Pastor Brooks stood right here on this bima and said, "We love you. You are our brothers and sisters. When you need us, we will always be there for you." And I cried. It was exactly what we needed to hear. And then it was April, which means Miami Beach Gay Pride. Again, part of me wanted to just sit it out this year. In fact, a lot of synagogues who had marched with us in the past did sit it out, including the Israeli embassy. But we went, smaller and present. And as we marched, people asked us if we had extra Israeli flags for them to wave. The drag queen, who was announcing the different groups in the parade as they passed by, said, "And here are our Jewish brothers and sisters. We love them. They are always here for us. What's happening is terrible, and we are here for you, honeys." Then the mayor asked me to say a blessing at her State of the County address. I went thinking I would be the only clergy person, but there were 4 faith leaders. And there was Imam Bilal Kirakura from the Kendall Mosque, a man I had previously thought of as my friend who had said nothing to me after the October 7th attack. And he welcomed me with a huge smile, asking after my family like nothing had changed. And then he told me he was planning to fly home to Lebanon. I asked him if he was scared, and he told me that his country hates Hezbollah. And then it was Ramadan, and I wanted to tap out, but instead I compromised and went to an iftar dinner, the meal that breaks Ramadan, at FIU instead of the mosque I usually go to, thinking I would avoid seeing Imam Samra, who, when I reached out to him on October 9th, only said he prayed for peace. Not what I wanted to hear, which, by the way, was a condemnation of Hamas. But of course, right when I walked in, I saw Imam Samra, and instead of avoiding him, I sat down next to him and told him that I was disappointed that he hadn't reached out to me, and that Jews feel lonely and attacked, and I didn't want him to feel that way too. And he asked me to come to dinner. And it reminds me how important relationships are, how it's hard to hate up close, and that I cannot read people's minds, and that I certainly cannot change people's minds if I am no longer in the conversation. And, of course, that sometimes doing the brave thing can open up conversations. In February of 2013, during the Syrian civil war, 7 Syrians arrived on the Israeli border in need of serious medical attention. The medics there provided them with care, but it was very clear that it wouldn't be enough to save their lives. So Salman Zarqa, who at the time was head of the IDF Northern Command's Medical Corps, quickly sent them to a civilian hospital where they could receive higher level of care. They were treated, some having surgery, and every single one of them survived. Over the next 18 months, over 5,000 Syrians were treated in that hospital, including a 10-year-old diabetic girl whose mom brought her there after their village was bombed. The girl was unconscious, and her mother thought that she was dead. Shortly after they arrived on the border, the IDF brought them into Israel, where the girl was treated for the next 3 months. During that period, the medical staff trained her mother on how to care for her child once they left the unit, teaching her how to check her daughter's glucose levels, how to give her insulin injections. They wanted to make sure that this woman was able to keep her daughter healthy once they left. And so they returned to Syria. And 4 months later, the girl came back for a checkup with a present for Dr. Zarka, a drawing of the Israeli flag with a big heart and her name on it that said, Toda Rabba, thank you in Hebrew. Those doctors were not there with the goal of changing hearts and minds. They were there because that's what it means to be a Jew, to not stand idly by while your neighbor bleeds. But for that girl and her mother, their actions changed everything. They went from demonizing Jews and Israelis to loving their doctor and the state of Israel. Going a bit further back, it reminds me of Queen Esther, how it was her relationship that saved the Jews, that the king's love for just one Jew changed his view of all of the Jews. And it reminds me that most people are not Haman. Most people are not evil. Most are Rosh, ignorant, but capable of good and loving. And 3 core teachings have been guiding me. The first is that we are commanded to help raise our enemy's ox, meaning we have to do the right thing, even if we don't particularly want to. There's a beautiful understanding of this commandment, which is that sometimes we think someone is our enemy, and then we help them lift their ox, not because we want to, but because God says we have to. But in that interaction, they may think, maybe I've been wrong all along. Maybe we aren't enemies. And an opening, the possibility of friendship is created. We show up because we are Jews. We may want the relationship to be reciprocal. It may hurt when it's not. We may want to tap out, but the Torah says we raise our enemy's ox, and so we raise the ox. And I'm thinking of love your neighbor as yourself, and about how much self-love and compassion that demands. Love yourself. Know what you stand for, who you are, have a strong back, and then you can open yourself up to others, hearing others and why they think the way they do, and maybe even loving them. And finally, Rav Kook's text, all the Torah, ethics, mitzvot, learning, and practice come to remove the obstacles that prevent an all-encompassing love from expanding and spreading to every corner of life everywhere. It is so hard for me not to let hate take over. So hard. But I don't want to be hate-filled. It is so hard for me not to dehumanize. They're monsters, evil, scum. But that makes me like them. It's so much easier to be angry instead of so incredibly heartbroken and sad. But I would rather be wounded with a heart full of love. So I am trying desperately not to walk away, not to say that justice will no longer define my Judaism. And I am trying not to be blissfully ignorant, to not turn my head when allies and so-called friends yell Free Palestine. I am trying to stay in relationship even though it is hard. Because if there is one thing I have inherited from my ancestors, it's that we can do the hard thing, and that the hard thing is often the holy thing. I'm wishing you a happy and safe New Year and an easy fast.